Most automotive OEMs have a net zero goal by some year. But the sheer fact is with existing cathode manufacturing techniques, you're 100% not going to get there.
Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome back to our podcast, the show where we chant the mantra, there has to be a better way. Today on the show, we're going to examine how one of the three main components of lithium-ion batteries is made in a way that's expensive, energy intensive, and uses a lot of water. But our guest will tell you it does not have to be that way. But before we get into how to future-proof EV batteries, the requisite podcast logistics. I'm your host, Lisa Ann Pinkerton. I support mobility startups with my PR firm, Technica Communications, and I support all genders in this space with women in clean tech and sustainability. If you appreciate us as much as we appreciate you, please take a moment and go to your podcast app and drop us a review. Every star helps. You can also cover some of the costs of our podcast by becoming a Patreon member. Please click on the show notes to find a link to our Patreon page. All right, so we all know the EV revolution is coming, and depending on where you live, you might be seeing these changes in the streets. That's why in episode 2 of our first season, we argued your next car will be an EV. A bold prediction, I know, but we're not the only people who think that way. Fast forward to season 3, and Bloomberg NEF expects the EV market to grow to $8.8 trillion by 2030. It's just in 7 years, people. And between then and 2050, they expect passenger EVs to make up the bulk of sales. Now, to put that into perspective, babies born this year will be in second grade when EV passenger sales are expected to be ballooning. And considering that batteries play a big role in the cost of EVs, it makes sense that we need to bring those costs down. Cathodes are the component I alluded to at the beginning of the show that makes up 60% of the cost of an EV battery, generally speaking. And that's why our guest is working at the nexus of EV battery materials and advanced manufacturing to influence how this aspect of the battery is manufactured. Her name is Virginia Klausmeier, and she's the CEO and founder of Sylvatex.
I would say electric revolution is definitely well on its way. The way that we think about the world is more around the energy, the energy foundation is changing, and the structures to change that foundation are being rebuilt, and they need to be rebuilt so that they withstand for centuries to come, right? So that is why we consider future proofing, so that you can build the future of the clean energy revolution for generations to come.
And so what's wrong with batteries right now that makes them not prepared for the future?
So I think the high level, the battery sector has done a lot of development, and over the last, decades has come down to specific material sciences that work to perform the way that humans need them to. Then now the next biggest stage we have as sort of, I'd say, the industry is to scale those materials in a way that is appropriate for the volumes that's needed, and to also bring the price points down. So those are, when you look at what the problem is, as the two issues are how to scale in a cost-effective, carbon-neutral way.
It makes sense that we would start this electric vehicle revolution based on battery technology that existed previously. Like you think about Tesla famously using laptop batteries and chaining them together for their vehicles, simply because that's the technology that was available at the time. And they weren't really thinking about scaling up to massive numbers. They were just focused on let's just start somewhere, right? So now that we've the EV revolution's established, it's happening. More EVs are selling all the time. I appreciate your perspective that now we get a chance to think about how do we want to scale these technologies and how can we do it thoughtfully because if we're just basing it on it, what I would consider this sort of the incumbent technology, that's not sustainable.
It wasn't, incumbent solutions weren't designed that way, right? A lot of the batteries were, how do we get it good enough to work in the iPhone? And it has been the same type of lithium ion battery, background, but they're changing the cell designs, right? So now you have these huge battery cell manufacturing plants that have designed the cells to be more compatible for electric vehicles and energy storage applications. But the part of it that's really interesting is that the next step is down the supply chain on actually looking at all the components that go into the battery, right? So what are the cathode, the anode? How do we scale those in a way that is appropriate for the market and where it's going and where it is, today?
Yeah, that leads into my next question, which is your company, Sylvatex, I find fascinating because the IP at the foundation of the company can be used in a variety of different ways. And you've chosen to focus on the electric vehicle market, specifically batteries and cathodes. Can you explain to us what is the work that you're doing with your IP to help future-proof batteries in the future?
Completely. As an earthling, just to bring it full circle, as an earthling, the whole goal is to ultimately curb carbon emissions of humans to mitigate climate change, right? So when you're looking at the battery pack, and you have the plus side and the negative side of the battery pack and the electrolyte that goes between those are the main components. The plus side, the cathode, makes up 60% of the carbon life cycle of the battery, and thus the vehicle or, the energy storage module. So it's a very energy intensive carbon sink. It's also 60% of the cost of a battery. So, the cathode material makes up a disproportionate amount of the cost and the carbon life cycle. Our thesis and our focus on the cathode was making those materials in the most effective way possible on a cost and a carbon side and a scale side, so that it can help to reduce the bottlenecks in the supply chain, but also, of course, driving the market on a price point and having it be the best in class solution for the ultimate goal of reducing carbon emissions and climate change.
And thank you. And there's some water savings as well, right?
Oh, huge amounts. I mean, right now, water's cheap, right? So I think this is one of the things that and we know it's getting more scarce, right? So if you think about future proofing, or if you think about really, the impacts of what we're rebuilding today in the energy revolution is how do we see the world operating in 2050? And to operate in that world, you have to have processes that require really no water, no energy. Even though it might be cheap today, it's not going to be, and they're not going to be readily available, and that you can't have waste. You can't have, you need to have recycle loops, etc. So our process took all of that in together and made it into our solution for that market.
Okay, so what is your process specifically? What are you doing to support the a more, what I would think of as like a more sustainable or lower carbon cathode?
So current solutions for making the cathode material that goes into the battery cell are, it's called co-precipitation, but it's a multi-step process that uses a lot of energy. It's very water intensive. It's also very expensive. So to build out, one of these manufacturing facilities takes about $500 million. So it's extremely expensive, and they're not flexible across chemistries and inputs. So one of the things that we do know is that the markets are going to, as every industry does as it starts to get commoditized, is that you need to expand the range of input materials. So coming from recycled materials or different mines globally, that could be input. and also have a broader range of output materials. So the way that we thought about our process and how we designed our process was to exactly future proof it. So sort of three things need to be true. One, you have to have a process that is the most energy efficient, uses no water, has no waste. Two, you have to have a process that has a broader range of inputs. As broad as can be is the best way to capitalize off of commodity markets, right? So broader range of inputs, which is how we operate. We have a single step process that is a dry process, so it uses no water and it has a lot more optionality. And then on the output side, we can pretty much produce any chemistry, but we're targeting on the majority of what's in the market and what's going to be in the market for the next decade to come right now.
Mm-hmm. So how does your process get implemented with battery manufacturer OEM? How do you work with them, or how does this process then become reality in a battery?
We'll just say in the US, there's, 20 new battery cell manufacturers, but to date, there had only been Panasonic, right? So let's just go with the example of Panasonic with Tesla, because
the OG,
paved the way. So Panasonic, they purchase a large amount of cathode material that goes into their battery pack. So they don't make it. They purchase it. They have a couple different vendors they go through to maintain the supply. So if you think about all the cell manufacturers, they're doing the same thing, but the added element is that the actual automotive OEMs, they have mandates of needing to actually have a certain amount of those components be made in the US or wherever they are domestically, right? So I'm only giving the US as a working example. So the actual, the US and North America really didn't have any cathode manufacturing. 98% of cathode manufacturing has been done in Asia, primarily in China. So you're starting to see little bits of that. IRA is a huge instigator, little bits that come to the US and come within North America to build out these supply chains to produce cathode material that then drops into the cell at the cell level. And then, of course, that cell provides the battery cells to an electric vehicle OEM.
Okay, and what does the cathode material look like? Is it in powder form, or if I was to hold it in my hand, what would it look like?
Boom! You see this?
Yeah.
So for those of you who cannot see it, yeah, it's just black powder material.
Uh-huh.
This is how you move it around. This is what you produce. This is cathode active material powder. And then that gets supplied, and then they turn into a little slurry, and it goes onto the cells that you see more, I'd say, readily on those videos, the promotion videos.
And so would you work with existing cathode material manufacturers, or are you thinking you'll manufacture your material yourself?
Ooh, good question. That's like the $1 billion question. Yeah. Today we are pretty bullish on doing early scale production ourselves. And then, it's kind of like all market and, all good early stage companies. Once you prove it, then everyone wants it, right? So you take on the majority of the risk, and you get to capitalize the most off the benefit. So we're definitely pretty bullish on that in the short term. And so we're going to be producing cathode material at small scale, and then the sky is kind of the limit after we can build repeat on how we commercialize through joint venture, partnership, licensing opportunities, etc.
Mm-hmm. And would the work that you're doing to make a more sustainable cathode active material then support these automotive OEMs in their ESG mandates and reporting?
Completely. I mean, most automotive OEMs have a net zero goal by some year. Some are bullish and say 2035, some 2050. But the sheer fact is, with existing cathode manufacturing techniques, you're 100% not going to get there. So if you happen to be listening to this and you're a OEM, EV OEM board member, you must know that you have to look at your supply chain and invest in alternative manufacturing methods that are more sustainable, that do not have water, that are the most energy efficient, etc., to get you even to that path of having a net zero goal in sight.
Oh, tell me this. We talked a lot about traditional lithium-ion batteries, and then there's some other types of batteries that are sort of that people are talking about and attempting to develop. And I would love your expert opinion on them. They're called solid-state batteries. What's your take on those types of batteries, and how should we be watching them as they develop?
Well, I think that, so I'll just say this, everyone has an opinion about solid state batteries. And for my business in cathode, actually, solid state batteries use more of the cathode that we'd be producing than less. So they're usually changing the anode material and changing the electrolyte. So for our business, it only grows exponentially with the increase of solid state. What you see in the market is definite interest in solid state techniques, batteries, mostly because some performance, but also safety within the EV OEM marketplace. The projected timeline for large scale, I think, is, in the next decade, you're probably not going to see them really dent the market too much, but you're starting to see some early stage stuff come on supply.
And how is a solid-state battery different than the traditional lithium-ion batteries that we're familiar with?
Yeah, the solid state is sort of how it sounds like the intent. So traditional lithium ion battery, you have the cathode, the sort of the positive sign, the negative sign, and the electrolyte. The electrolyte is liquid. So I'm sure you've seen those like videos if something gets punctured and then and then you see flame, then it flames. And that's usually because of the liquid electrolyte. Solid state aims to try to make that a solid process with the electrolyte. So solid state electrolyte. So you're changing the anode material from like a graphene to some type of silicon, there's different innovations there, lithium metals, etc. And usually there's also performance benefits. So you have higher energy density, different levels of high performance capabilities. So it is a safety and a performance benefit that they're aiming towards.
Thank you. It's something I want to explore in another episode. So thank you for the advice there.
Again, like the whole battery industry, if you just imagine like it's growing like this, right? So solid state, there's a world for them, and it's further out, and it's gonna be some version of that, of the market share. But for the, in the, I don't want to say the next decades, the probably the biggest problem that right now all EV OEMs and battery cell manufacturers have is access to the critical materials. So that's their biggest bottleneck. It's not performance, really.
Resources. It's always about the resources, isn't it?
If we used a lot less energy, then maybe it wouldn't be, but we use a lot of it. And we want things to be big, fast, and cheap, right? Very challenging.
Hmm. Well, and what about battery recycling? I've read that with your cathode active material, that could potentially make recycling a more advantageous prospect. What's your take on battery recycling now? What do you watch? What are you seeing coming in the future?
Yeah, battery recycling is going to evolve in Europe much faster than in the US. Every country, continent, is trying to secure their molecules of energy, however they're trying to do that, right? Recycling is a way to do that. Mining is a way to do that. So you're starting to see that that's going to be consistent around most regions of the world. So it's definitely it's definitely a big part of the overall picture is to create a full life cycle that's well to wheel. The methods right now, the industry has sort of two problems. One is that the volumes of scale, like even in America, in the US, we had one very large gigafactory, and in the next 10 years, we're going to have probably like 30, right? So the volumes of material that are going to be coming through And if you imagine 10 years of life in those batteries, you're going to start, it's about 10 years out until you're seeing huge volumes of material be recycled, right? So getting them in the pipeline is kind of a hard thing. You don't want batteries to expire early because that's not good for really any carbon story. So you want the life cycle of that to extend as long as possible. But for the recycling story, it's a challenge. So that's one thing, is that getting really a large amount of volumes into the supply is going to take some time. And then the other is doing it in a way that overall is carbon efficient, right? It doesn't make, it's important to have a fully closed loop with these materials that makes it very renewable, and a very positive story and carbon story. But you need to actually extract out the nickel, the lithium, and those components to recycle them. You need to have a process that doesn't require a huge amount of energy or toxic chemicals. So that's a different piece of the industry problem, is how do you lower the carbon profile of recycling? And, in our piece of the world, what we look at is how do we take material that comes off the recycle loops faster so they don't have to be synthesized, purified, and then add a sulfate molecule onto it so you have all sulfuric acid waste. So that's where we use inputs from the recycle streams that are much less processed. So it's overall probably the best in class carbon story you can tell, while upgrading that material to high performance material, right? So a very good economic story as well.
It seems like you're hitting, it's like I hate this phrase because everybody uses it, but like you're checking all the boxes, right? Lower cost, less water, less waste, better to recycle, higher quality product. It's exciting to imagine a world where we've really thought critically about the materials we're using ahead of the time, so that when we do scale up the EV revolution, we're not looking back. Generations aren't looking back at what we did and be like, oh, well, they really didn't really think about that at all, did they? They just kind of ran with it. Now we got to clean up their mess.
That's my worst nightmare, is having my kids in 20 years, if it's in 10 years, be like, Mom, what were you thinking? And I think, we have that in our generation, with our parents, like what they did with plastics, right? It was new and it was super useful. And now everyone's like, oh my gosh, it is incredibly toxic and it can never leave this planet. And it's really impossible and costs so much to recycle. And, the true cost of plastic is not at all incorporated into it, and it is, so it's still, for like a lot of petroleum based products, right? You still have that problem. So I think with batteries and this, there is a level of attention that is higher, much higher than there was on sort of our, what I call it, like our V1 of the energy infrastructure, right? But there are areas that are really important and prevalent that need to be built out, right? And part of them is specifically the manufacturing side of these materials, because, all of it, if it uses huge amount, if they're energy, intensive and water intensive and create a lot of toxic chemicals, like there's no way that will add up. That math will add up in like decades, at all.
We're just making more problems for ourselves.
Completely. But I'm not gonna lie. Today in the marketplace, all anyone really cares about is volume and production and cost. Really, right? So you have the board members at these high level, companies that have these longer visions, right? But the trickle down effect of what that looks like is it is a commodity. It's commoditized, right? How much can you produce at what price point? And so I think that it's going to be really, really important that how the market grows is that we do make wise choices, but we can also reduce the costs, and that's how the market adopts it, right? And increases market adoption.
And it has all these ancillary effects. I think you're onto something, because with My fiance Julian Adler, who's he's an executive coach, he taught me this concept of like you're only responsible for the information and knowledge that you have at any one time, right? And often people are doing the best they can with the resources they have. So if we look at the plastic analogy, people didn't know, 40 years ago that you shouldn't be microwaving plastic or like using like they didn't realize what plastic was how it was gonna affect the future. But here in this conversation, and what you've done with Sylvatex is you've revealed like here's some information. Now we know how we can do better, and we have this information now. So let's use it. Once you have the information, collectively, I believe as society, we're responsible for it.
The big marching thing is there is a better way. There is a better way. There is a better way, right? So the first step is, and I think we're past this point because around COVID and post, so in 2021, 2022, it was like, is it going to take off? Okay, electrification has taken off. Energy storage has taken off. The numbers are looking great. I think most, you see this every day. Renewables are gaining higher traction of becoming the better cost approach, long term, short term, etc. Right. So all of that is happening in a very positive way. So I do think sort of the first version of, we got to do a better way, like is happening. And then the next version is building out the growth to support these supply chains has to be done thoughtfully, right? It can't just be, we are in a different place with chemicals and certain amount of waste, disposal, but energy and water is it's still pretty cheap in the scheme of things that even though you reduce that, the cost, it doesn't get, add in the cost as much.
And I mean, if you're able to address like you're talking about reducing the cost of cathodes, and that's 60% of the cost of the battery, it seems to me that the industry would be looking for that better way and would be interested in applying new methods for reducing that cost.
Here's a version of the world that I think almost everyone who's a politician or a business person wants to see happen. That you have somebody in an area that is economically deprived, that has usually those areas have worse emissions because there's more diesel being used. They're heavily trafficked, etc. So these people living in those areas are low income and they get the worst pollution. So then they suffer medically and their life expansion, like all these elements. So imagine a world where, like people in these types of communities are able to buy an electric vehicle that provided them jobs, that were more localized. And they also, around them, their world was becoming electrified. So they don't have those emissions. And so they ultimately are able to be in this like very different life space. And the only way we can reach that population of people is if we're able to reduce the cost of vehicles, period.
Earthlings, what I find fascinating about the Sylvatex process is that the IP they've developed is really applicable to a variety of industries. And I can see why they've chosen the battery as a place for them to start because it seems like there's so much ground to be made up, both from a sustainability perspective and a cost perspective. So keep your sensors pointed at Sylvatex so we can watch how they lead us into a battery future that we can all be more proud of. In future episodes, we'll also look at solid state batteries and battery recycling to continue this series. Now, before we go, we get to restore our faith in humanity. Today's spotlight comes to us from Venezuela, where artist Oscar Olivares has completed what he said is one of the world's largest ecological murals made entirely out of bottle caps. This art is really cool and beautiful, and we'll put a link to it in our show notes so that you can see it. It's 385 square meters and it's made out of 400,000 bottle caps. Local residents collected 1 million of them for the project and they also helped him put it together. He said that he was able to educate residents on the importance of recycling through this project. And Olivares said that there's no real education or policies about living a sustainable lifestyle. So his projects help lead more people into wanting to recycle and to be a part of his work. Doesn't it feel better knowing that there's people out there in the world making it better? We hope you will all choose to do the same wherever you are on this beautiful blue-green space flower we call home.